Post-war Europe, 1950s, 1960s. I shall attempt to identify each slide as I introduce it, and we'll see if this works. So, post-war Europe, 1950s and 1960s. First slide is titled Aftermath. Okay, and what we have obviously after World War II is a pretty much wrecked continent, between bombing and the movement of huge armies and battles. Many cities are virtually destroyed. There are millions of refugees, especially those who have fled from the Russians as they moved into Germany and Europe from the east. So Europe is a real mess and needs to rebuild quickly. And one of the most remarkable feats of American generosity is something called the Marshall Plan, which the Americans essentially send huge amounts of money to help the Europeans rebuild their cities and their infrastructure and their economies very quickly before it, just crashes into who knows what more totalitarian states. So an incredible act of generosity by the Americans enables the Europeans to help them rebuild very quickly and get back on their feet and resettle refugees where possible, either back to where they came from when things settle down or in their new homes. Now here's the big change, okay? What we've seen the entire semester, right, from the Peace of Augsburg to the Treaty of Westphalia to the Peace of Vienna to the Treaty of Paris, is these all attempts to have the Europeans supposedly just sort of mind their own business, stay inside your own borders, don't mess with other people, and they always break down in some way. Because you end up with these big, huge wars that break out for religious reasons or political reasons or over trade or defining the borders or just, and in World War II, right? Claiming all the Germans who've been Germany. So the complete change here is instead of saying everybody just sits by themselves, it's never worked, is we're actually going to tie everybody together economically and politically and militarily in big alliances, not little alliances against each other like you had before World War One, right? But we're just going to actually work as cooperatively, collectively, to help each other and to maintain the peace. And maybe that collective effort will stop individual countries from causing trouble. So what we get after World War II are economic ties. You get the IMF, the International Money Fund, and the World Bank. These are funded by the richer countries, mostly the United States, but a lot of money from Europe and parts of Asia as well. And they're designed to give short-term loans or long-term loans, emergency aid, in order to help stop countries from going into economic collapses. This is a way of preventing these huge destabilizing depressions that had happened under capitalism, the 1870s, 1890s, early 1920s, and of course the big one in 1929. And when you have these crashes and when you have destabilized economies, it's when you get authoritarian states and wars over resources. So these are designed to help countries grow and expand their economy with outside help, and also short-term emergency money if you're having an economic crisis, to sort of help stabilize economies around the world. There are political alliances. There's the United Nations, which meets in New York, and that is supposed to be all the countries in the world meeting and arbitrating disputes, sending peacekeeping troops to sort of get in between disputing countries, to try and prevent wars, to try and minimize wars, also sending aid to countries other than money, like food and so forth, to help them stabilize and and so forth. And of course, in Europe itself, the EU, the European Union, which started out as simply what was called the common market, breaking down trade barriers, but now has become the European Union, in which they use a common currency. You can live and work in any other country in the EU. If you're French, you can go live and work in Germany. Okay, open borders. In other words, it is one market, labor market, goods market with no internal barriers. It's just like the United States. There's no barriers between states. And so you have here an economy of over 300 million people. Again, tying these countries together rather than putting them as individual competing units. And then a military alliance, because the Russians had moved into Eastern Europe and stayed there at the end of World War II. The democracies of Western Europe realize that they're going to have to, they can't just, again, go their own way. So we formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's North Atlantic because Canada and the United States are involved. And it is a military alliance. Any attack on any member is considered an attack on all. So in other words, peace through everybody aligned together. You can't mess with Italy because you're messing with all of us. And so a mutual defense, which has been pretty successful. I'll actually go to, the Warsaw Pact is the communist alliance under Russia of the Eastern European countries. In fact, if we go to the next slide, and that's the one entitled NATO with the map, the blue countries are NATO, and the red ones are Warsaw Pact. That would be Russia and the Eastern European satellites. And it's effective. You'll notice that the white countries are neutral. Many of the countries between the two alliances, by everybody's agreement, stay neutral, so they have a sort of buffer zone between the two alliances in a lot of areas, except in Germany. And then you sort of have these sort of sided up against each other. NATO is, contrary to what you often hear, these countries are very well funding their defense. They have significant militaries. The French and British develop nuclear weapons. They have aircraft carriers, and the Germans have a whole bunch of panzer divisions. NATO in the 1950s through the 1980s is incredibly well funded, and these are very efficient militaries. The French and British especially, because they have overseas, the remnants of overseas empires, are able to send aircraft carriers and troops thousands of miles away. These are not helpless countries being defended by the United States. The reason you have the United States in NATO is, instead of waiting 2 or 3 years for the Americans to get involved in a war, the Americans are there. They have troops in Germany. So if anybody attacks NATO, the Americans are in from day one. And of course, you don't mess with the United States in a big war. Yeah, right. And so with the United States, with military involvement right there, NATO is about the most powerful military machine in the world. So this is effective. We've essentially, Europe has been at peace among its members since the end of World War II. We'll look at the disintegration of Yugoslavia. It's one of those white countries at the bottom of I'm pointing and you can't see, bottom of the map. They'll disintegrate in the 1990s and there'll be some conflict there. But on the whole, this mutual military alliance and mutual economic ties in the European Union, Europe is as close as ever. I think this works better than we've seen in the previous centuries. Let's go to the next slide, and the next slide is called decolonization. And what we've had here is all of these empires that the Europeans built in the 19th century are going to pretty much disappear. The primary cause is nationalism in these other countries, right? In Africa and Asia and so forth, saying, we want our own nation state. You believe in national self-determination. You believe that each group, religious, ethnic, whatever group, should have its own nation state. That was the deal of nationalism. That's the concept of what Europe works under. Why can't we? So the idea of a self-determining nation state, which the Europeans claim is the best way of doing things, everybody's saying, okay, then that's us. And when the European countries struggle in World War II, the Japanese take a bunch of territory, for example, from the Netherlands and France in Southeast Asia. These independence movements gain steam. They're saying the Europeans are not invincible. Okay, and so in this period, in the 50s and 60s, there are the wars of decolonization as throughout Africa and Asia, countries fight for their independence. Now, it's not all war. Many of these become peaceful transitions. It's like the European countries themselves are like, we don't want empires anymore. It is wrong to have empires. It is wrong to be conquering Nigeria and taking its resources. So in many ways, the Europeans are like, yeah, we agree. You're right. We don't need to be there. And so for the large majority of these countries, it's a peaceful transition of power from the European to whoever becomes a new government. Other countries where the Europeans see it as a very strategic, important place with a lot of resources, they want to sort of hang on a little longer. And you have some pretty bloody wars in places like Algeria in North Africa. And of course in Vietnam, which the Americans are getting involved in. But ultimately, the Europeans even end up withdrawing from these places. Like, it's just not worth all this fighting. Why did the Americans get involved in a place like Vietnam? It was a French colony. The problem is, the European countries, of course, are capitalist. And so what happens is these independence movements turn to communism. They see capitalism's evil because here's the capitalists controlling our country and their corporations are stripping our country of its resources for the benefit of this country. Capitalism's bad. So we're going to turn to communism and have the people take over control of the resources and run it for our own benefit. So they turn to communism, which of course makes the capitalist countries very threatened because, you don't want communists taking everything over. So when Vietnam, for example, became a very effective communist insurgency, communist nationalist insurgency, the Americans stepped in and said, we're going to stop them. We don't want the communists to start spreading through all of Asia. And, the Chinese had become communist after World War II in a successful revolution. So you got giant countries like Russia and China and now Vietnam and other countries in Southeast Asia. You could have this massive expansion of communism. So the Americans decided to stop communism, even though they're siding with what was a colonial-supported government. It's more important. And that's, you get wars in Africa that way. The Americans get tied in places in the Americas like El Salvador and Nicaragua because there's communists getting rid of capitalist-supported dictators in their countries. So these wars of communist capitalists get tied in with wars of nationalists versus colonialists. And unfortunately, sometimes the capitalists tend to support the colonial dictators because they're fighting against communism. It's very messy. But by the end of the 1960s, virtually all of the European empires have gone, whether it be peaceful transition or after a period of warfare. They're gone very quickly. So the European empires lasted about 100 years, Industrial Revolution through mid-20th century, and they're done. And now we have a very complicated world. So let's move back to Europe. So they've given up their empires, sometimes reluctantly. They've rebuilt with massive help from the Americans. Now, how do they move forward, right? So I'm going to the slide called Recovery. Okay, it's after the decolonization slide. And the Europeans are like, okay, nothing works, right? We tried so-called free market capitalism. from the Industrial Revolution on, and it's miserable for the vast majority of workers. You have economic crashes, like I said, 1870s, 1890s, 1920s, 1929 Great Depression, which created all this crisis where there's almost no democracies left. And even when it's successful, when the economy is going well, only a handful of people benefit from it. So capitalism hasn't worked. It's unstable and brutal. Socialism ends up with a corrupt, inefficient government running the economy, and everything's just, and you could end up with communism, a dictatorship. Same with capitalism, right? You end up with so much uncertainty, you end up with an authoritarian government that sort of tries to take control because of capitalism being so. So you could have fascism on one end and communism on the other end. So capitalism, socialism don't seem to work. So what do you do? Feudalism? Go back to the Middle Ages? Yay. Right. No. And in my definitions handout, which is somewhere in the Moodle, you have to go back up. I think topic 4, I've got definitions and so forth. I described social democracy. And the Europeans go for a combination of socialism and capitalism. The United States, more or less, it's probably more capitalist and a little less socialist than the Europeans, but it's a similar path. And it's called social democracy. An old term, a very old-fashioned term for it was democratic socialism, which of course we've seen a very old political candidate using an old-fashioned term for it. But it sort of evolved into what we call social democracy. And what you do here is you have a capitalist economy. Probably about 70% of the economy is capitalist. It's right. That's has clearly shown the most efficient way to produce goods, right, through privately owned enterprises, have them compete in a marketplace, right. 70% of the economy is capitalist. There's some regulations, always are, okay. But what you have is the provision, and this is the socialist part because it's public ownership of specific goods and services, right? What I've got on the slide is called public goods. The government owns, okay, a specific set of services that if you put on the market for profit, only a certain number of people can afford them. And what has been realized is in order for your people to have maximum opportunity and for a minimum standard of living, certain services need to be publicly owned. And what that is, of course, is healthcare, education, what we call infrastructure, which is water, electricity, and a lot of your transportation, right? Trains and buses and roads and stuff like that. Broadly provided public goods. That way, you have a healthy, educated population that has a means of basic living, okay? And that they then have equality in terms of opportunity across society. Everybody has equal access to education and training. Everybody doesn't have to worry about being bankrupted or just dying from poor healthcare. Okay, you go in and then what I do with my life is up to me. I have an equal opportunity as someone else because I don't have to worry about healthcare or education. That's the key. Those are the two key fundamental things. I don't have to get a job that supplies healthcare. I can get whatever job I want. Retirement, right? The Americans will adopt Social Security, Medicare, same thing, right? Retirement for the elderly so that they're not, once they're too old to work, what do you do? Starve to death? Depend on your family to use their overstretched time and materials? No, you have retirement. Unemployment benefits. Capitalism does have its cycles. And you get unemployed. So instead of starving in the streets, here's an unemployment check. Basic stuff like that to so that people aren't starving on the streets and desperate to take whatever job at whatever horrible pay a capitalist will offer them because, hey, if you don't like the job, I'll fire you and hire another starving person, right? The old 19th century form. But literally a safety net so that people don't suffer from the ups and downs of capitalism, and infrastructure and public goods so that people have equal opportunity regardless. And it works. We've had the most remarkable economic boom in the history of the planet, right? The Industrial Revolution was an amazing technological boom. The post-war recovery is the most, remember, this is the age of extremes, the 20th century, right? We've gone through the worst, 2 world wars and the Depression. It's awful. This is the other extreme. This is the great period of economic growth. And it's still more or less continuing to today in Europe. You look at all their standards of living, standards of wealth, everything. Europe's the richest and best place in the planet to live. Unions were strong. So even in the capitalist part of the economy, the workers could there was legal protections for unions, and the workers could negotiate with capitalists over wages and conditions on a relatively equal basis, and so forth. And what this means is people are getting a good paycheck. You're a factory worker, and instead of half starved, working 72 hours a week, the unions negotiate the weekend. The weekend is thanks to unions. You get the 40-hour work week thanks to unions. So you have a 40-hour work week with a living wage. Yeah, we take it for granted. No, that got negotiated. And what does that mean? These people with a living wage and some time on their hands can actually now enjoy what I'm calling mass culture. It's not just, okay, we have a decent job. It's like, I have a decent life, right? On the weekend, you go watch a sporting event. I've got a soccer picture up there. Or you go to a concert, the Beatles. Watch the TV, listen to the radio. Play records. Buy some nice clothes. Ordinary factory workers. Or coal miners. It's unprecedented in history. Amazing. Out of the flames, out of the wreckage, out of the destruction, out of the terror comes this remarkable revival. I love it. Hope we can keep it. Let's go to the last slide. Society. Which sort of leads on from what I was talking about with mass culture, right? By this period, the majority of people in Europe are living in towns, so it's a heavily urbanized society. That's a development starting from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So this is an urbanized civilization, not a bunch of peasants, which leads to a whole different type of culture. Right, people in cities hanging out in coffee shops. Okay, it's just cultural change, not peasants hanging out in a village. Technology continues to boom. Remember the second industrial revolution, right, with electricity and oil, right? So by which time we now have the automobile. That is the car in the slide is a Jaguar, an E-type Jag, one of the most beautiful cars ever made. 12-cylinder engine. Everybody has cars. My grandparents had cars. Huh. Okay, yeah, and going on vacation. You have time now to go to the beach for a holiday. I know, it's kind of weird to talk about everybody piling on a beach. Strange world, right? Or even fly. It's still kind of elite at this point, but more and more people can fly somewhere for a holiday. Or at least take the train and go to the beach. long weekend, maybe a week holiday. Ordinary working people affording a vacation and a car and a house and enjoying it. Technology and communication is important too. We have, especially in information, this is the beginning where I mentioned previously, right? You have televisions and radios in most households, the telephone in most households. Now, it's stuck on the wall and you have to, answer it, and you connect it to the wall by a cord, but it's a telephone. So communications accelerating, computers beginning to become more functional, more available. Okay, I mentioned travel, jets and cars, trucks, but even in the life sciences, improved genetic modification of crops for better viability, work on medical in terms of dealing with disease. How ironic. Organ transplants, reproductive, both in terms of improved fertility and the invention of the pill, which we can talk about. What's the cultural element when you have the pill? Women are now free to have reproductive freedom. I don't have to get pregnant if I don't want to, or I can get pregnant when I want to. Okay, more reliable birth control. Control over my fertility, control over my body, my reproductive is a huge step for women. It all sounds wonderful, doesn't it? But it's still a masculine society. Women still legally in virtually most every country have fewer rights than men legally. They often can't own property or have their own bank account, or certainly don't have access to the same jobs. Minorities, nah. In the United States, until the mid-1960s, you've still got the Jim Crow laws and lynchings, for example. And in Europe, same thing, minorities mistreated. Gay people, forget it. It's actually a criminal offense to be gay in most of these countries. You're in jail. So straight white males still on top. Okay, benefiting wonderfully, and other people too. But we still got a long way to go. But amazing progress.